computer. Okay, so this is the meeting of the Zhiru Ng Book Club, and we're starting a new book tonight. We're going to be reading Zhiru Ng's book, The Making of a Savior Bodhisattva, Dizang in medieval China. I forget exactly what the subtitle is. We'll get to that. And we're going to start our class with chanting the Zhiru Ng chant, and then from that move directly into beginning to discuss the book. So I'm going to, let me see. First, I got to find the chant. I really should have had that ready, but I didn't. And I think I have it here. Let's see. I have a folder. It's called New Chants. I think it's in my New Chants folder. Yes, here it is. And which one of these is it? Yeah, this is it. So now I can see it, but you can't because I haven't shared my screen yet. Okay, so sorry, I'm muting myself now.
吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨，吉祥波萨。묘력장장원이 오마르마니 다니 사바하 옴 바라마니 다니 사바하 옴 바라마니 다니 사바하 원흉틀지노노 마모카 살바다라 사다야 시베홈 옴 마모카 살바다라 사다야 시베홈 옴 마모카 살바다라 사다야 시베홈 복소소태교 산다라니 남 사만다 못하남 아바라지 하라사 사나남 다냐타 옴 카카카에 카에 홈홈 아바라 아바라 바라 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 지타 지타 지리 지리 파라 파라 선지가 시리에 사바하 나무 사만다 못하남 아바라지 하라사 사나남 다냐타 옴 카카카에 카에 홈홈 아바라 아바라 바라 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 지타 지타 지리 지리 파라 파라 선지가 시리에 사바하 나무 사만다 못하남 아바라지 하라사 사다남 다냐타 옴 카카카에 카에 홈홈 아바라 아바라 바라 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 지타 지타 지리 지리 파라 파라 선지가 시리에 사바하 보보즈노 옴 호로 호로 사야롭게 사바하 옴 호로 호로 사야롭게 사바하 옴 호로 호로 사야롭게 사바하 보냥지노 옴 사마라 사마라 미마라 자르마 자고라 바라홈 옴 사마라 사마라 미마라 자르마 자고라 바라홈 옴 사마라 사마라 미마라 자르마 자고라 바라홈 자치증명가스지 대해중수가혼진 보공가량 공가에 모능진솔 불동
Okay, so it's let's see, time for people to ask questions. If anybody has a question or something you want to bring up now, as always, and I do want to emphasize this, it's fine to jump in at any time if you have a question, or just something you want to talk about. Speaking of things to talk about, though, let's talk about Dizang, also known as Zhiru Ng, in China. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again and go into slideshow mode here. And so one thing that I want to do is to kind of give some background information on, uh, so Zhiru Ng's book. All right, actually, before I dive too deeply into this, let's see if I can bring up. Yeah, here we go. Zhiru Ng's book. I have it here, but I also happen to have a PDF copy of it. The Making of a Savior Bodhisattva by Zhiru Ng, Dizang in Medieval China. So she, as a careful scholar, Zhiru Ng makes a point of saying in the introduction, don't get too hung up on the phrase medieval China. She'll kind of, she uses it just as a matter of convenience. But what she's talking about when she says medieval China is she just chosen like the 6th century to the 10th century. Okay, so that goes from like 500 to 1000 AD, about a 500-year period, and that's the period of time that she's covering in the book. And why does she pick that period of time? Well, because it basically is when Dizang first shows up, in, as far as we can tell, in China. This bodhisattva, who had been called Kshitigarbha in India, shows up somewhere in the 6th century. And Zhiru Ng wants to focus on the kind of the early development of this bodhisattva in China, when she feels that there was a more fully formed, complex version of the bodhisattva in Chinese Buddhism, that later, in her opinion, I think she's partially right about this, but in her opinion, Dizang became a little overly associated just as basically the person that you pray to when someone dies, and there's definitely more to Dizang Bosal than that. And that's her kind of mission, is to convince people that there's more to Dizang than just the person that you pray to when someone has died. Although that certainly is, it's hard to get around how important that can be. Everybody dies. But because she chooses to focus on this period of medieval Chinese history, I choose to try to give some background, some explanation. I assume that people here are not particularly experts in Chinese history, which I am not either, but I do want to talk about it and provide what I think is some useful information to know what's going on in what Zhiru Ng is talking about, and just in general what's happening in Chinese Buddhism. So let's see, let me get my pointer working here. There we go. Now, the 5th century doesn't come in until down here, but I wanted to start this going back to the Han Dynasty. You can't. Chinese history is so. One of the big problems with Chinese history is that there is a lot of it, and it's really complicated. Even if you focus in on any given period of time, even some of these very short periods like the Sui Dynasty and the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period, there's just so much going on, and but you can kind of cautiously try to summarize and simplify things a little bit, just so you can get some, just so you can see kind of the forest and the trees, because you have to be able to see both. So the Han Dynasty is important. Basically, Chinese people call themselves Han people, and they're referring back to the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty is also where the Chinese characters that we currently know first came about, what's called regular script. I don't know what it's called in Chinese, but prior to the regular script, people used things like the seal script, which I know Joe is a big fan of, and the clerical script. People still use the seal script for signing things. But anyway, oh yeah, I wanted to yeah, here we go. I also have some maps here. See, so this is the outline here is the uh, this is the modern day People's Republic of China, and then the part that's shaded in is it's called the Western Han on this map. Western just means it's not that there is an Eastern Han somewhere else. Western Han means that during the time when that this map refers to, they were using the Western capital, which I guess is Chang'an. But yeah, let's see. I don't want to get too. I've lost my mouse for some reason. Yeah, okay, here we go. Okay, let me get out of this. So I'm going to go over each of these periods a little bit more. This is just kind of the big picture. And I do want to look at this quote from Zhiru Ng from her book. The introduction of Buddhism into China was carried out by Central Asia, particularly Parthian and Indian missionary monks who followed the Silk Route used by caravan traders, arrived in China during the second half of the Han Dynasty. So one of the reasons to go back to the Han Dynasty is that is when Buddhism first enters the scene in China. By the first century AD, or the Common Era, historical sources record the existence of Buddhist communities in China. Now, the energies of early missionaries and their Chinese collaborators were concentrated on the translation of Buddhist scriptures. Now, we don't really know that that's what they were concentrated on, really. What we do know is that that's what we have. That's what's left. We have translations and the records of the people who did the translations, and that's pretty much that's most of the earliest evidence for Buddhism in China. And of course, depending upon the personal backgrounds and interests of the translator, sutras chosen for translation could be from early Buddhist or Mahayana traditions. The Chinese were exposed to a whole range of Buddhist literature, from stories of the Buddha's previous lives to manuals of meditation, teaching of shunyata and the lack of inherent nature of all things, expounded in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And so they were a lot like we are now, they were exposed to a slice of Buddhism, and sometimes it was just a bit of a grab bag, which is what we have right now in the West. There's, the vast majority of Buddhist writings haven't been translated into English. And so unless you know Chinese or Tibetan or Sanskrit or Pali, you have to take what has been translated for us. Okay, so so there's the Han Dynasty. There's this kind of period of division and disunity. There's the Sui Dynasty when things got reunited. There's the Tang Dynasty, which you may have heard of as the Golden Age of Zen. It was actually the Golden Age of Chinese culture generally, or at least that's how it's romantically remembered. Then there's this brief period of the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms, and then there's the Song Dynasty. And I want to go through these a little bit more detail. Okay, so first off, way back in the Han, I already talked about this a little bit. It lasted for over 400 years, and Chinese history at this point in time, starting in 202 BC, there was already at least 1400 years of recorded Chinese history up to that time. And if you go back prior to that, then there's all kinds of legends and archaeological evidence, but really recorded history of China begins 1400 years before the beginning of the Han Dynasty. Confucius, for example, lived 3 centuries before the Han Dynasty even began. And so he was already an ancient sage at the beginning of this timeline here. Now, discussion of Buddhism during the Han tends to focus on translations because that's what we have. These translators tended to be from Central Asia, and so this is interesting. They for the most part, almost, especially the earliest translators, were not native speakers of Chinese, and in many cases, they were not native speakers of the languages that they were translating from either. but actually they did a pretty good job, at least according to people who are professional translators today who do know all of these languages. Um, and Identifying exactly who and what kind of Buddhists these people were can be a little complicated. For example, one of the earliest translators, this guy An Shigao, and the name An means someone from Parthia, which is like way in the west of Central Asia, part of modern day Iran, actually, that far over. So anybody anybody at this time with a first name of An means that they were from that part of Central Asia. But none of the sutras that An Shigao translated were what we consider to be Mahayana sutras. Nevertheless, the Chinese referred to him as a great bodhisattva, which is a thing that really only Mahayana Buddhists go around saying. So it can be difficult, and it'd be problematic to try to to pigeonhole these people. And let's see, Han Dynasty ended in 220. So the important thing about the Han Dynasty, Buddhism was introduced to China at that time. China was unified, and is considered a very important period of Chinese cultural development in general, not just because Buddhism came to China, but because they developed the writing system that they currently have, although they had other scripts before that. Anyway, let's move on to the next period, which is very messy. We have three kingdoms: the Jin Dynasty, the 16 kingdoms, the northern and southern. Now, what happened to the Han Dynasty ended when the north of China was invaded by so-called barbarians. That was anybody who wasn't Han Chinese was considered a barbarian. And many of the Han Chinese did flee to the south. Now the Han Chinese lived primarily in what is the northern part. So why did the barbarians invade the northern part? Well, it's like, why do people rob banks? Because that's where the money is, and the barbarians invaded the northern part of China because that's where the wealth was, and that's where the Han Chinese elite were mostly based. So the Han Chinese went to the southern part of China, which they considered to be, well, first of all, it was much hotter, much more tropical, much more to them it seemed much more disease-ridden, and also less civilized. And the more civilized part of China was now in the hands of barbarians in the north. Now, interestingly, a lot of these people who invaded China were either already Buddhists or became Buddhists very, very quickly. And often these barbarians were more Buddhist than the Han were. Let's see, where do we? So the Buddhists, the barbarian Buddhists, since they're barbarians, they were interested in magic. They were interested in more personal and devotional, more overtly religious forms of Buddhism. The Han Buddhists, the more educated, sophisticated Buddhists who were now based in the South, they were more interested in reason and philosophy, and their form of Buddhism is often referred to as gentry Buddhism. And, who wants to practice gentry Buddhism? It sounds kind of snooty and boring. And to some extent it is. Anyway, the famous translator Kumarajiva. So Kumarajiva, who was one of these Central Asians, one of these barbarian leaders in the north, heard about this great Buddhist teacher named Kumarajiva, and so he sent one of his underlings to go fetch Kumarajiva to come, be his court Buddhist priest. Unfortunately, the underling decided to imprison Kumarajiva and hold him for ransom for 16 years. And Kumarajiva during that time learned Chinese. So when the person who had originally sent for him finally got him released, then Kumarajiva spent the last 12 years of his life translating Buddhist texts into Chinese until his death in 413. So even though this period is a period of great turmoil and disunity and disruption in China, it's actually a lot of important stuff happened. Now, one of Kumarajiva's disciples was another famous Buddhist named Dao Sheng. Okay, now, unlike Kumarajiva, Dao Sheng was Chinese, born and raised Han Chinese. And after his teacher Kumarajiva died several years later, Dao Sheng became embroiled in the famous controversy over universal Buddha nature. And the thing was that Dao Sheng was the only person, or at least the only prominent Buddhist teacher in China at the time, who insisted that all sentient beings possess Buddha nature. Imagine that. Everybody else said, no, 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 no. Yeah, and I mean, common sense argues that, you know, that it's a hard argument to make that all beings have Buddha nature, but Dao Sheng stuck to it, and he was actually briefly excommunicated, but quickly reinstated after everybody else came around. And one of the reasons for this controversy and confusion was because the sutra that was in question, which is the Mahayana Parinirvana Sutra, was still in the process of being translated. And so the belief that not all sentient beings have Buddha nature was based on a partial translation. And when the whole thing was translated, they said, oh my God, Dao Sheng was right. All beings have Buddha nature, according to the Buddha, anyway, and he should know, right? So now, also during this time, there was a guy in the at the end of this period. See, at the end of this period of disunity, things had settled down a little bit. There was one dynasty in the north and one dynasty in the south, and the emperor of the dynasty in the south, which is where the Han Chinese were in power, for a long time, was a guy named Wu, and this is the famous Emperor Wu, and he became emperor the old-fashioned way by murdering his rivals. But once he came to power, he wanted to be seen as a very good Confucianist and a good Buddhist at the same time. Now, Emperor Wu has not been treated very fair. I wouldn't say unfairly, but he hasn't been treated very kindly by history. One reason is that he ruled for 47 years, but then 8 years after he died, his dynasty was overthrown. So what that means is that he inherited a very stable regime, but left behind a very unstable regime. Or at least that's the way people have generally interpreted it. And so and of course, the famous Zen story is that Bodhidharma came and had his famous dialogue with Emperor Wu. And so Bodhidharma left the genteel Han Chinese South and went up to the northern barbarian region where the Shaolin Monastery was, or at least that's the legend. So it's kind of an interesting, this gives kind of an interesting perspective. Bodhidharma rejected the it seems, the genteel gentry Buddhism of the South and preferred the wild barbarians of the North, which is where he ended up. Although eventually the tables were turned because Zen became associated with the Southern school. But anyway, let's keep going. How are we doing on time? Okay, good. So in the Sui dynasty, China was unified again under a single emperor. And by now, these barbarians, quote unquote, in the north were a lot less barbarian. They had all learned Chinese. They tended to dress and adopt Chinese customs. And this happened in other. China has been invaded and conquered more than once by people who start out as barbarians in turn and become Chinese in the process. Now, during the Sui, let's see, actually, Zhi, this is the guy who wrote the Four Great Vows in the form that we know them. He lived. He was born during the Northern and Southern dynasties period. He lived in Hubei, which is it's in the southern part of China that was continued to be under Han rule, but it's in the northern part of the southern part of China. But it never fell to the barbarians, Hubei. And yeah, Xi, he was important. Hui Ke, okay, we talked about Bodhidharma in in the last slide, Huike was the second ancestor, often referred to as the second patriarch of Chinese Zen. There's a typo, Chinese, or whatever that is. And he lived into the Sui. Huike and Sengchan, who was the third ancestor, survived a brief persecution of Buddhism from 574 to 577. And Dao Shen, who was the fourth ancestor, lived into the Tang dynasty. Okay, now Emperor Wen, who was the founder of the Sui dynasty, it didn't last very long. But there were two lasting effects of the Sui dynasty. One was that China remained unified after the Sui dynasty when the Tang dynasty came to power. The other major impact of Emperor Wen was that he saw Buddhism as, he said, the people in the north and people in the south all like Buddhism. So Buddhism is a unifying a tool for unifying what previously had been a bunch of people who were all fighting each other. And so he promoted Buddhism as a way of reunifying China, and that had a lasting impact. Throughout the Tang dynasty, all of the emperors in the Tang dynasty supported Buddhism until close to the end, when one didn't. We'll get to that in a second. But now I want to talk a little bit about what was going on in India, because it's a little important to look at what's going on in India at this time with respect to the subject that we're talking about, which is this Dizang Bodhisattva, who's still known as Kshitigarbha in India. And so a very famous Indian teacher, Shantideva, refers to Kshitigarbha in his most famous work, the Way of the Bodhisattva, and he specifically refers to Kshitigarbha as one of the great bodhisattvas, and so which is how we still refer to Kshitigarbha in the Zhiru Bosal chant, or no, not in the Homage to the Three Jewels chant. Kshitigarbha is listed as one of the four great bodhisattvas. Shantideva actually lists 7 great bodhisattvas, which includes Avalokitesvara, Manjushri, Samantabhadra, Akashagarbha, Maitreya, and good old Mahastamaprapta, who, anyway, one of the lesser known great bodhisattvas. Anyway, so Shantideva lived around the same time as Zhiru Ng, Shito, who wrote the Sandokai, Matsu, famous Matsu, Mind is Buddha, Matsu, Layman Pang, and Guishan. Guishan is, if you've heard any Dharma talks by Zen Master Muhan Shim recently, she often refers to Master Guishan in her talks. Xuanzang, the great translator, was born during the Sui dynasty, but by the time he was ready to go to India, make his famous journey to India, it was already the early Tang. He returned to China in 645. In addition to the Heart Sutra, he also translated longer Prajnaparamita sutras. And his, even though Kumarajiva is usually regarded as the best and the greatest of all the Chinese translators, there's some things like Xuanzang's Heart Sutra and also Xuanzang's translation of the Medicine Buddha Sutra are still the preferred versions. Oh yeah, the Tang era was also when Wu Zetian was the emperor of China. Some Chinese refer to as the empress of China, but Chinese does not have a word for empress. It's the same word, whether you're and Wu Zetian was the first and only woman to be the emperor of China. She officially ruled from 690 to 705, but already long before 690, she wielded pretty much power as an emperor behind the scenes, and she was a very strong supporter of Buddhism and had a very strong influence on the development of Buddhism in the Tang Dynasty. The An Lushan rebellion happened during the the Tang Dynasty. Now, even though the Tang Dynasty is usually referred to as like this golden age of culture and philosophy and literature, um, there was a lot of turmoil during the Tang Dynasty. A huge proportion of the Chinese population died during the Anlushan Rebellion. A lot of the death was due to famine, because the war interrupted the agricultural calendar dramatically. Anyway, another great figure during the Tang Dynasty was Zhang Mi, and he was very interested. He was very important for the history of Korean Buddhism, because he was the person who's most closely associated with the idea of sudden enlightenment, gradual cultivation, and he was a major inspiration to Janol, who was one of the great teachers of Korean Buddhism. And then there was this brief period of persecution towards the end of the Tang. The only emperor who did not support Buddhism during the Tang Dynasty was Wuzong. Okay, now, so we're almost to the song, but we're going to take a 5-minute break and then come back and take questions and continue on with discussing Chinese history as it relates to Dizang Bodhisattva. So, hi, Elizabeth. Okay, before I jump into any more Chinese history, I want to share two questions. Everybody can see this now, right? I'm still sharing my screen. These are two questions that Camille asked by way of email, and these are my. So, why did Avalokiteshvara become Guanyin and Kshitigarbha become Dizang? So there's two aspects to a question like that. One was, so why did the name change? Okay, and then the other question is, did more change than just the name? So actually, there are. I was just watching a lecture given by some Buddhist scholar that was on YouTube, and she absolutely she insisted. She said, Avalokiteshvara. I think she actually did wag her finger while she was saying it. She said Avalokiteshvara is not Guanyin, and Guanyin is not Avalokiteshvara, which is which is wrong, basically. I'll go so far as to say that she's just wrong. But everybody's has a right to their opinion, and that question, is Avalokiteshvara, did something so completely change when Avalokiteshvara became Guanyin that we can consider them to be two completely different things? And the same question can be asked about Kshitigarbha and Dizang. Actually, Zhiru Ng talks about questions like this in her introduction. But here I'm just going to look at the focus on the names for now. So sometimes Chinese Buddhists attempted to approximate Sanskrit names. So Buddha becomes Fu, which is somehow a Mandarin approximation of Buddha. And usually often when the Chinese are approximating Sanskrit, they also shorten it. So Fu becomes, or Buddha becomes Fu, and, Bodhisattva becomes Puto or something like that. In Sino-Korean, it becomes Bosal. So, but Fu is not a translation of Buddha into Chinese. The word, this character doesn't really have any meaning in Mandarin other than Buddha. Manjushri became Wenshu, which again is a bit shorter and kind of a Chinese approximation. Maitreya becomes Milei, and that's the case for many Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. But in other cases, the Chinese gave Buddhas and Bodhisattvas new Chinese names, and so this is the case for Dizang. And so in both Dizang and Avalokiteshvara, one can guess that maybe they were just too hard to say, and so instead of transliterating, that is attempting to pronounce or mispronounce the Sanskrit in Chinese, they just took the meaning of Kshitigarbha, which means something like earth store, and translated it into Chinese into Dizang, which means something like earth store or earth womb or earth. You see all kinds of, and when people try to translate it into English, it doesn't make much sense. Okay, and then let's see, Samantabhadra, whose Chinese name is Puxian, which is a literal translation of the Sanskrit Samantabhadra, which means something like universal worthy. And then, of course, a lot of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas have multiple names or multiple ways of referring to them. In fact, Shakyamuni Buddha, well, he's Shakyamuni Buddha, he's Gautama Buddha, he's the number of different ways that he can be referred to. Sometimes he's referred to as the Tathagata. Sometimes he's referred to as the Tathagata Buddha. Anyway, that just makes it even more complicated. But in in general, sometimes the Chinese translated the names and sometimes they transliterated the names. And I don't know that there's any really good explanation for why they did which in any given case. But then there's some people insist that in the process of Buddhism coming to China, that these Buddhas and Bodhisattvas were fundamentally transformed into something completely different than they had been originally. And I think that's, as I said before, I think that's wrong. Now, another question is, why does Zhiru Ng talk about cults and cultic practices? So the word cult kind of has negative connotations often in English. Think of a cult, you think of Jim Jones or Waco or, something like that. Cults are really interesting. Cults in that sense can be really, really interesting, but you don't really want to be associated with them. And for academics who study Buddhism, they refer to cults without any pejorative connotation. It just means the practices and beliefs that are associated with a particular Buddha or Bodhisattva. So there's a cult of Maitreya, there's a cult of Avalokiteshvara, there's a cult of Dizang. So in the first place, these calling them cults is not intended to be derogatory or make them sound scary or make them sound like their members are dangerous true believers or anything like that. It's just a convenient way of referring to a particular set of beliefs and practices, but it's also really important to know that these are not exclusive cults. So it's not like you have to decide which one you're going to join. Now, some Buddhists will go that far, especially some Pure Land Buddhists think you should, you have to give a really, really special place to Amitabha Buddha. For the most part, all Buddhists in East Asia, including Korea, Japan, China, and many Buddhists outside of East Asia who are, belong to some Zen or other tradition that comes from East Asia, most Buddhists are cool with Amitabha, think Amitabha is great, maybe even chant, Namu Amida Bull or whatever, your particular accent is, Korean or Japanese or whatever, but not necessarily to the exclusion of other Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. Anyway, so are there any questions about these questions or about anything that I've covered so far? I'm not gonna spend too much more time on Chinese history, unless you beg me to, in which case I can. But I want to get talking a little bit more about more directly the subject of the book. So let me go back a little bit. Slideshow. Slide. All right. So we talked about these questions. Now we go back to where we were. Still have a couple of slides left on Chinese history that I'm just going to skip over. You're welcome to look at them. Everybody will have access to the file that has all these slides in it. Just want to draw attention to these two little marks in this breakdown of the different dynasties and periods. This is the beginning of the 6th century here, and this is the end of the 10th century right here. So this is the part of Chinese history that Zhiru Ng is really focused on. It doesn't cleanly begin or end with any particular dynasty or period. It begins when Dizang begins in China, and it ends when she believes, that the full story of the development of Dizang has really come about over this period of 500 years. And so I have a very nice slide on the 5 dynasties and the 10 kingdoms, and one on the Song dynasty, which is very interesting. The Song dynasty slide is just a list of people and books that came out during that time. It's a really interesting period of time. But now, let's see. Oh yeah. So here is a long quote from a another book um, by a great Chün-fang Yü, who is a Buddhist scholar um, who's written that Zhiru Ng refers to Chün-fang Yu's book because Chün-fang Yü and Zhiru Ng are two of the only people who've written recent scholarly books on particular cults of bodhisattvas. Um, and Chün-fang Yu's book is a big fat book. It's a really wonderful book. It's everything you ever wanted to know about Avalokiteshvara and Kuan Yin. But here's what she says about some of the history that we've just been talking about and its relationship with the development of China and development of Buddhism in China. After the fall of the Han, China was divided between North and South. It was during these years of disunity and instability that Buddhism started to be established in China. Buddhism in North China, which was ruled by non-Chinese rulers, enjoyed imperial patronage. Buddhist devotion took concrete forms with the large-scale rock sculptures at Yunnan. Buddhism in the South was characterized by its philosophical speculation and participation by members of the aristocratic classes. Remember, I said in the South China it was more gentry Buddhism, and that's a term that scholars often use to refer to the type of Buddhism that developed in the south of China during this time. And then this gentry Buddhism was influenced by other Chinese philosophical movements and ideas, the teachings of Lao Tzu, Chuang Tzu, and the I Ching, which together is sometimes referred to as the dark learning. And this provided a vocabulary that Buddhists use to, it's usually referred to as matching concepts. So they would take a concept from Taoism and or Confucianism and or some amalgam of Taoism and Confucianism and match it, take some term, that was already in use in, like we say, emptiness, emptiness is an English word, as opposed to nirvana, which is not an English word. So sometimes we use Sanskrit words, sometimes we use English words. The Chinese were going through the same process. And although later on Chün-fang Yü points out that better than this matching concepts was one of the really great contributions that Kumarajiva made was that he really established Buddhist vocabulary in Chinese. And so a lot of what Kumarajiva didn't completely abandon this idea, the Kei or matching concepts, but he made it much more sophisticated and really established the Buddhist vocabulary in the Chinese language that is still used to this day for the most part. Then when China was reunited under the Sui, Buddhism began a new phase. The most notable development was the creation of indigenous Chinese Buddhist schools. So now, which is very true. So this is where a lot of people think that Buddhism became completely different from how it had been in India before, because these schools didn't exist in India. But they were just one thing that you can count on Buddhists is to be creative and think for themselves. So that's basically what the Chinese were doing. Yeah, it's all good. Her book is really wonderful. Everybody should read it. Oh yeah. So one thing she does say about these Buddhist schools, that they continue to exist up to the present time. However, since the Sung dynasty, Sung or Song, it's called either one, there has been a pronounced tendency to combine the schools. So, and this is quite important, actually, in understanding how Buddhism develops in China, that it's not particularly sectarian. You do have different schools. A lot of times the schools are not that separate. They're not trying to wipe each other out, basically. Okay, all right. Now, let's see. Do I want to get into this now? I do. Let's see how much time we've got. Oh yeah, okay. Well, let's look at an actual quote from the book. Okay, this is from uh, the stuff that I have from Jan Nadir. Okay, so or Natier. Who here knows who Jan Natier is, or Jan Nadir? Anybody ever heard of her? She's a really great Buddhist scholar, um, and she's actually one of the great experts on the Heart Sutra. She's done a tremendous amount of research on the Heart Sutra, and she's the one who basically figured out where the Heart Sutra actually comes from. That and her scholarship is kind of detailed, and but basically Xuanzang took a big chunk out of one particular sutra and then gave it a beginning and an end, and took a dharani from another source and called it the Heart Sutra. He may, so it's not, and which is, you might say, well, so a lot of people don't like Jan Nadir's explanation of where the Heart Sutra comes from, because it doesn't, it's supposed to be the words of the Buddha, but it is the words of the Buddha. It's just kind of rearranged, basically, is what happened, and that's actually quite common in Buddhism. Buddhists do like to rearrange things. Oh, all right. Now here is Zhiru Ng talking now. Buddhologists tend to relegate Dizang to the category of folk or popular religion, where Buddhism has lost its distinctive contours and exists more or less as amorphous phenomena frequently subsumed under indigenous religions. So they view the Dizang cult as a marginal topic, a stepchild of Buddhology, irrelevant to the study of Orthodox mainstream Buddhism. Now, one thing that she's kind of pointing to here is that even though Buddhologists or Buddhist studies people often use this term gentry Buddhism in kind of I don't think anybody intends it to be a compliment or whatever, but actually gentry Buddhism is often what Buddhist studies scholars prefer to study. Gentry Buddhism is very intellectual. Gentry Buddhism is very philosophical and rational, and doesn't necessarily involve a lot of worshiping, and doesn't involve, faith, or maybe not so many miracle tales and all that stuff. It's more to the taste of your average, Western academic. And so there's a tendency to, among Buddhologists, to say anything that doesn't fit that pattern is just folklore, or indigenous religion, or it's not the orthodox or mainstream Buddhism. This attitude harks back to the distinction between so-called great and little traditions, which is a bad idea that people in religious studies came up with many decades ago, that there are great traditions, great religious traditions, and basically not so great religious traditions. And the great religious traditions are very philosophical, very interesting, very rational, and the little religious traditions are, the stuff that the unwashed masses believe in. And let's see, Robert Redfield, I guess, was the person who first came up with this. Now, yeah, only the elite and the literate are followers of the great traditions, whereas and they know what they're doing. They consciously follow this tradition, whereas the unwashed masses are unwittingly, they're illiterate, they're peasants, all these terrible things. Who wants to be an unwitting, illiterate peasant who's just following something without knowing what it is they're following? So this is not the way things really work. Now, what Zhiru Ng points out is that nobody explicitly accepts this kind of differentiation between the great traditions and the little traditions any longer, but people still act like that's a thing. Buddhist scholars still tend to treat the more refined, the more philosophical, the more intellectual traditions as the real thing, and everything else gets mixed up with folk beliefs and superstition and stuff like that. And what Zhiru Ng is saying is basically, not only should we avoid using these words, but we should avoid applying that framework, which basically is what happens, is that a lot of Buddhist scholars are applying the same framework, although they're not using the overtly using the labels. And so Dizang thus defies any attempt to segregate elite doctrine from cultic practices. Rather, he exemplifies and demonstrates continuity, not only between doctrinal and devotional elements, but also between so-called elite and folk religion. Okay, so that's a good quote. I like that quote. And here's another good quote. And so here she's talking even more specifically about how people think about and talk about and treat the whole idea of devotion. Religious devotion. In part, the marginalization of religious devotion can be traced to Protestant rhetoric that condemns Catholic excesses, meant to satiate the ritualistic and emotional needs of the uncritical masses, in presumed opposition to the basic spirituality of Protestant Christianity. And so this is actually a surprisingly widespread. Very few Buddhist scholars will openly say anything like this, but if you look at what they actually do say openly, they're often acting, are often moving from a point of view that basically says that anything that is they won't say Catholic excesses. They will sometimes say uncritical masses. They won't say that they're doing something that is Protestant, but this is a really common pattern in Buddhologists. This disdain of it's also a common pattern among Western Buddhists as well. This disdain of devotional practices and the bifurcation of doctrine and devotion are hardly true of medieval Christianity, much less of Buddhist cultures. And Western scholars have increasingly called attention to the Protestant biases in Western scholarship on Buddhism. David Snellgrove. Anyway, so let's see. So that's all good stuff that she says. I just wanted to give some examples from I'm looking over to the side because that's where I have people's pictures now. I just wanted to give some examples from the actual book, in addition to digging up stuff from Chinese history. I do think I did, let's see, I've got a few minutes. Why did I drag in Jan Nadier? Well, so Jan Nadier, she's actually I believe she's from Indiana. She went to Indiana University as an undergraduate. And I'm from Indiana too. So I would pronounce her name as Nadier, but she actually goes by Natier, Jan Natier, and that's cool. She wants to. I mean, anybody who is fluent in classical Mongolian can call himself whatever they want, as far as I'm concerned. I'm not going to give them a hard time about it. But she has a whole book. It's a really interesting book on a very, very early Mahayana Sutra that used to be a really important and really popular among Mahayana Buddhists in Asia, and has become a relatively neglected and ignored recently. And so she goes into the reasons for this and some of the so what she's looking at is biases basically among modern Western Buddhists, and in particular, not just us. We are the unwashed masses of modern Western Buddhism. What Jan Natier is really talking about is the biases that are present among the elite Western Buddhists, the Buddhist scholars, these Buddhologists, of which she is one. And she says, so why has this very important sutra been ignored? And to answer her own question, she asks another question. Well, if this sutra is being ignored, what about these other ones that everybody pays attention to? What do they have in common? And she says that they have three things in common. And one of the reasons why this is important is because the Kshitigarbha, in particular the Kshitigarbha Sutra and the other writings that are associated with Jijang, Dizang, Kshitigarbha, don't fall into this pattern. So it's interesting, in my opinion. So the three things that they have in common is one, sutras like what she gives examples, like the Vimalakirti and the Lotus Sutra, others that people have probably heard of, they still have an extant Sanskrit version, which the inquiry of Ugra, the Ugra Paripurcha, something like that, sutra, it exists today in Chinese and Tibetan, but the original Sanskrit is lost. A second criteria for sutras that are popular among Western Buddhists in general and Western Buddhologists in particular is that they're also popular in Japan. And then, but there's a third criterion, and that is that they appeal to Western cultural preferences. So Jan Nattier makes a big deal about this, but it's really not surprising that Westerners are attracted to Buddhist writings that we can relate to. That's basically what she's saying. The problem, though, is that if we're not aware of this, if we're not aware that we are systematically selecting just the stuff that we want, because what happens then is that people will convince themselves, oh, these sutras are representative, or they are the real thing, and that the sutras that don't fall into this small, actually fairly small group of Buddhist writings are, well, they're not important, they're secondary, they're folklore, they may not even be the real, true, original teachings of Buddhism. They might be something that other people added on later on because I don't like them, and one of the reasons why this idea of Jan Nattier's is important is because Western Buddhist scholarship has become extremely influential in the world of Buddhism generally. Buddhists in China, Buddhists in Japan, and really Buddhists in Korea look to Western Buddhist scholarship as very authoritative, whereas in fact, Western Buddhist scholarship has a lot of limitations on it. So in let's see, do I have this? Oh yeah, this is a really interesting book. All right, good. There is a big movement in Korea to change the curriculum of what Buddhists in Korea study when they study Buddhism, and they have there's a long-standing tradition of a traditional curriculum of sutras and writings of Zen masters and things like that that have been studied for centuries. And there's a big movement in Korea to get rid of that and modernize the curriculum of Buddhism. And how are they modernizing it? They're modernizing it by adopting the basically the list of sutras that Jan Nattier points out. This book does not reference, I don't think Yuri Kaplan and Jan Nattier have ever spoken to each other. They're observing the same basic phenomena, that there's this kind of small group of sutras that Western Buddhist scholars like, and that Western Buddhists like, that have become kind of, thought of as being representative of Buddhism, and these are now being adopted in Korea. They're pushing to read only these sutras and not the things that have traditionally been studied in Korea. And so some people have pointed out that one of the main problems with that is that to the extent that they accept this new curriculum in Korea, there's no longer any Korean authors who are included in this stuff that Korean Buddhists are studying. And there have been some great Korean Buddhist writers. One, Zen Master Sung San used to always go on about Won-hyo. Won-hyo was one of his favorite teachers. There's no Won-hyo in the new proposed curriculum. And so one thing that's particularly embarrassing is that the two founding leaders from almost 1,000 years ago, the two people who were considered the founders of the Jogye order, none of their writings are included in the curriculum either. So both, so Zhiru Ng, the author of this book, and Jan Nattier, and also this other person I keep talking about. What's her name? I can never remember her name. It's very, it's a Chinese name. I'm not very good with Chinese. Chün-fang Yü. Yeah. So these are three scholars who are helping us to kind of get beyond some of the limitations that Western Buddhism and Western Buddhist scholarship. But at the same time, Zhiru Ng and Jan Nattier and Chün-fang Yü they're not outsiders. They're not troublemakers within Buddhology. They're well respected, and basically all the other Buddhologists think that these three are great, but they kind of ignore them. Or they go on and keep doing what they've been doing, which is to treat Dizang like a secondary figure and so forth. Anyway, so I want to continue talking about this introduction. If you have read Zhiru Ng's introduction, please read it again. It's really good. If you haven't read it, please think about reading it. And I think as we go through this and we talk about the things that she brings up, and it's actually there's a lot that you can gain, I think, by hearing us talk about it. Even if you haven't read the book, but I think you can get a lot more out of it if you have. And also, if you're inclined, I don't know why my lighting is so bad, but if you're inclined, send me questions, like Camille did, but not the same questions. So don't send me questions exactly like Camille did. And if anything just seems off or strange, or that you'd like to go into further, let me know about that too. Let's see, I'm going to stop sharing now for a second. Anybody want to unmute and ask a question or say something? And I didn't know whether or not to go into a lot of Chinese history, but really, I mean, Zhiru Ng, she's not assuming. Well, she is kind of assuming that people who are reading her book already know Chinese history, and you can kind of gloss over it, but it's best to have some background, some context for what this period of time. She is talking about the early days of Buddhism in China, the formative period. Yeah, I saw you unmute there, Camille. You were going to say something or ask something.
Oh, when you're done.
Yeah, I'm just rambling. I'm just hoping someone else will say something.
Okay. If I could jump in with another question. I was just curious as to the differences in like representation, like art representation of Dizang, and that he's depicted with like a shaved head, like a monk. And I feel like a lot of the image of bodhisattvas, they're not depicted as looking like monks. And so I was just, I don't know if that's something that is going to be talked about in the book, but that was just something I was curious about.
Yeah, it's kind of a big deal with Dizang. And this is one of the things that changes over time. And it did kind of, this is one of the things that settles down over time. And by the 10th century, there was kind of a set way of representing Dizang, and it was as a monk. And that is not it's not assumed that a bodhisattva is going to be represented as a monk. And if you read Chün-fang Yü's book on Avalokitesvara and Guanyin in China, the change, she goes through a sex change, and there are many times in many references to Guanyin, Avalokitesvara in China, where he is a monk. And that's one of the standard representations of Avalokitesvara in Chinese Buddhism early on, before Avalokitesvara becomes Guanyin, and Guanyin becomes a woman. So it's kind of a big deal, and she will talk about that, the different representations. The main thing is that he's a monk. He got a big stick, and he's got a magical orb, and those are his symbols. Okay. Let me see if I can find. Yeah, this is not it. But I'm going to find it. Oh, good. Okay, so we should end with the reciting the 4 great vows together. Thanks for coming, and I look forward to seeing you all again. There's a retreat coming up at the end of the month on July 29th that I'll be at. Anyway, so let me share my screen, and we'll recite the 4 great vows together. Sentient beings are numberless. We vow to save them all. Delusions are endless. We vow to cut through them all. The teachings are infinite. We vow to learn them all. The Buddha way is inconceivable. We vow to attain it. May whatever excellent qualities we have gained from this practice be extended for the benefit of all beings. All right. Thanks for coming. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great to see you all. See you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.